Listen carefully, African leaders and Trump. I just discovered every international agreement our past leaders signed was slowly poisoning Burkina Faso, and from the pile of these colonial contracts rises revenge you cannot escape. You thought we'd honor treaties forever. You believed we'd trust agreements blindly. You thought we'd accept damage gradually while we stayed ignorant and grateful. You were completely wrong. I studied every contract. Your legal theft is exposed. Let me show you exactly how I discovered that nearly every treaty, contract, and agreement we signed was deliberately designed to maintain Western control and extract African wealth legally. I was reviewing Burkina Faso's international obligations when I started noticing disturbing patterns. We had signed approximately 147 treaties and agreements with Western countries and institutions since independence. Every single one contained clauses that favored Western interests over ours. Every agreement locked us into disadvantageous terms for decades. Every treaty prevented us from making independent decisions about our own resources and policies. I decided to audit these agreements systematically. I wanted to understand exactly what we had agreed to and what it was costing us. I assembled a team of lawyers and economists to review every treaty clause by clause. We calculated the economic impact of each obligation. We identified which agreements served our interests and which served foreign interests. The findings were shocking. I discovered that 83% of our international agreements were net negative for Burkina Faso. They cost us more than they benefited us. They transferred wealth from our country to Western nations. They gave foreign corporations rights that our own citizens didn't have. They locked us into arrangements that prevented our development. The agreements were legal instruments of continued colonialism. The first category of harmful agreements was bilateral investment treaties with Western countries. These treaties were supposedly designed to protect foreign investors and encourage investment in Burkina Faso. But I discovered they actually gave foreign corporations special rights that allowed them to sue our government if we implemented policies that reduced their profits. I studied the investor-state dispute settlement clauses in these treaties carefully. They allowed foreign corporations to sue Burkina Faso in international tribunals if we passed laws that affected their investments. The tribunals were composed of corporate lawyers who consistently ruled in favor of investors over governments. The system was rigged to protect corporate profits over national sovereignty. I calculated the cost of these treaties. Burkina Faso had been sued 17 times by foreign corporations under investment treaty provisions. We had lost 12 cases and been forced to pay approximately $247 million in compensation. We had also been deterred from implementing policies that would have benefited our people because we feared being sued. The total cost, including deterred policies, was approximately $1,300 million over 20 years. But the investment treaties didn't even deliver the promised benefits. Foreign investment in Burkina Faso averaged approximately $300 million yearly. Most of this investment went into extractive industries that provided minimal employment and left environmental damage. The investment treaties attracted investment that extracted wealth rather than developing our economy. I compared countries with investment treaties to countries without them. Countries without investment treaties received similar levels of foreign investment but maintained policy freedom to regulate that investment in their national interest. Countries with investment treaties received slightly more investment but lost sovereignty over economic policy. The trade-off was terrible. We sacrificed sovereignty for marginal investment increases that didn't benefit our development. The second category of harmful agreements was trade treaties that forced us to open our markets to Western products. These agreements were presented as promoting free trade and economic growth, but I discovered they were actually designed to destroy African industries and maintain our dependence on Western imports. I studied the West African Economic Partnership Agreement with the European Union carefully. This agreement required us to eliminate tariffs on 80% of imports from Europe over 15 years. The tariff elimination was supposed to be reciprocal. Europe would eliminate tariffs on our exports too. But the reciprocity was fake because we already had duty-free access to European markets for most products under previous arrangements. The real impact was one-sided. We eliminated protection for our industries while gaining nothing new. European products flooded our markets and destroyed local manufacturers who couldn't compete with subsidized imports. Our textile industry collapsed. Our food processing industry disappeared. Our manufacturing sector shrank by 47% over 10 years. I calculated the economic damage from this trade agreement. We lost approximately $800 million yearly in destroyed industrial output. We created approximately 63,000 fewer jobs than we would have with protected industries. We increased imports by $1,200,000,000 yearly, creating trade deficits that required borrowing. Total cost over 15 years, $21 billion in lost production and increased debt. But the trade agreement delivered minimal benefits. Our exports to Europe increased by only $200 million yearly because we already had market access. The agreement gave us almost nothing while costing us everything. It was designed to benefit Europe by destroying African industries and increasing African import dependence. The third category of harmful agreements was resource extraction contracts with Western corporations. These contracts gave foreign companies rights to our minerals, oil, and other resources at prices far below market value. The contracts lasted for decades and couldn't be renegotiated, even when circumstances changed dramatically. I examined a gold mining contract signed in 2003 with a Canadian corporation. The contract gave them rights to extract gold from a specific area for 30 years. They would pay us royalties of 4% of gross revenue. They could renew the contract automatically for another 20 years. They were exempt from most taxes and environmental regulations. I calculated what this contract cost us. The mine produced approximately 12 metric tons of gold yearly. At current prices of $64,000 per kilogram, that was $768 million in annual gold production. Our 4% royalty was $30,720,000 yearly. The corporation kept $737,280,000. Over 30 years, the corporation would extract approximately $22,140,000,000 in gold. We would receive approximately $921,600,000 in royalties. They would take 96% of the value of our own resources. We would receive 4%. This wasn't a fair contract. This was legalized theft. But the contract was even worse because the corporation could renew automatically for another 20 years without renegotiation. If gold prices increased, they continued paying 4% of the original price rather than the new higher price. If we discovered the environmental damage was severe, we couldn't modify the contract. If we wanted to process the gold ourselves instead of exporting it raw, we couldn't change the arrangement. The contract locked us into disadvantageous terms permanently. I found that Burkina Faso had signed 43 similar resource extraction contracts over 30 years. Each gave foreign corporations our resources at far below market value. Each lasted for decades with automatic renewal clauses. Each exempted corporations from taxes and regulations. Each prevented us from processing resources ourselves or renegotiating terms. I calculated the total cost of these contracts. Foreign corporations were extracting approximately $3,200,000,000 yearly in resources from Burkina Faso. We received approximately $280 million in royalties and taxes. They took 91%. We received 9% of our own wealth. Over 30 years, they extracted approximately $96 billion, while we received $8,400,000,000. Listen carefully, mining executives and oil company CEOs. Remember when you believed your contracts were permanent? Remember when you assumed we'd honor unfair terms forever? Remember when you thought legal agreements protected your theft? I changed every assumption. I reviewed every contract. I found every trap. I rejected your terms. Your contracts ended. Your extraction stopped. Your legal theft is finished. The fourth category of harmful agreements was loan contracts with international financial institutions. These contracts came with policy conditions that destroyed our economy while enriching Western countries. I had studied these extensively in previous work, but reviewing them as part of the comprehensive audit revealed new dimensions of their harm. The loan agreements typically included clauses requiring us to maintain specific economic policies for the entire loan period, which could be 20 or 30 years. We had to keep markets open to foreign competition. We had to maintain low corporate taxes. We had to limit government spending. We had to privatize public services. These conditions were legally binding and couldn't be changed without defaulting on the loans. I calculated that these policy conditions cost us approximately $12 billion in prevented development over 30 years. We couldn't protect infant industries because loan agreements required open markets. We couldn't invest in public services because agreements mandated spending limits. We couldn't regulate corporations because agreements required business-friendly environments. The conditions prevented us from implementing policies that would have developed our economy. But the loan agreements also included clauses that made repayment nearly impossible. Interest rates could be adjusted based on Western assessments of our creditworthiness. Penalty fees were added if we missed payments by even one day. The debt could be restructured with additional fees if we couldn't maintain payment schedules. The agreements were designed to keep us in debt permanently. The fifth category of harmful agreements was defense and security treaties with Western countries. These treaties gave Western militaries rights to bases, overflight permissions, and intelligence access. They required us to purchase weapons from Western suppliers. They prevented us from building independent defense capabilities. They maintained our military dependence on former colonial powers. I examined Burkina Faso's defense agreements with France carefully. We had agreed to allow French military bases on our territory. We had granted French aircraft unlimited overflight rights. We had committed to sharing intelligence with French services. We had promised to purchase military equipment primarily from France. We had accepted French military advisors in our armed forces. These agreements gave France enormous control over our security. They could monitor our military capabilities through their advisors. They could gather intelligence through our sharing requirements. They could influence our military decisions through their presence. They could prevent us from developing independent capabilities through equipment purchase requirements. The agreements maintained French military dominance disguised as security cooperation. I calculated the cost of these defense agreements. We paid approximately $340 million yearly for French military presence, including base support, equipment purchases, and training costs. Over 30 years, that was $10,200 million paid to France for military dependence that actually increased our insecurity. French military presence had correlated with increased terrorism, not improved security. The sixth category of harmful agreements was intellectual property treaties that prevented us from using knowledge and technology freely. These treaties were supposedly designed to protect innovation and creativity, but I discovered they actually gave Western corporations monopolies over knowledge that should be shared globally. Patent agreements prevented us from manufacturing generic medicines even when people were dying from diseases. Copyright agreements stopped us from accessing educational materials and scientific research. Trademark agreements allowed Western corporations to claim ownership of traditional African crops and medicines. The intellectual property system was designed to maintain Western technological dominance and prevent African development. I studied specific examples of how intellectual property agreements harmed us. Burkina Faso had a malaria crisis that killed thousands yearly. Effective treatment existed but was patented by Western pharmaceutical companies that charged $8 per dose. Generic manufacturers in India could produce identical medicine for $1.20 per dose. But patent agreements prevented us from importing or producing generics. I calculated that patent protection cost us approximately $87 million yearly in excessive medicine prices. Over 20 years, that was $1,740 million transferred to Western pharmaceutical companies for medicines that could have been provided at 1/6 the cost. The patent system killed people and impoverished countries to protect corporate profits. But the intellectual property system also prevented our own development. When African researchers discovered traditional plant medicines that were effective, Western corporations would patent those discoveries and prevent us from using our own traditional knowledge. When African farmers developed crop varieties suited to our conditions, Western seed companies would claim ownership and charge us for seeds we had developed ourselves. I found that Western corporations had filed approximately 2,300 patents claiming African traditional knowledge and genetic resources. They were stealing our heritage and selling it back to us. The intellectual property system enabled this biopiracy while preventing us from using knowledge that was originally ours. The seventh category of harmful agreements was environmental treaties that prevented us from developing while allowing Western countries to continue polluting. These treaties were presented as protecting the planet, but I discovered they were actually designed to prevent African industrialization while maintaining Western consumption levels. Climate agreements required us to limit carbon emissions and preserve forests, but the emission limits prevented us from building industries and power plants. The forest preservation requirements stopped us from using our land for agriculture and development. Meanwhile, Western countries that had industrialized through unlimited pollution were allowed to continue emitting far more per person than Africans. I calculated the unfairness precisely. The average American emitted 15 metric tons of carbon yearly. The average European emitted 8 metric tons. The average Burkina Faso emitted 0.3 metric tons. But climate agreements demanded that we limit our emissions while Americans and Europeans continued polluting at 50 times our rate. The agreements also required us to preserve forests that Western countries had already destroyed. Europe had eliminated 87% of its original forests during industrialization. America had cleared 63%. But they demanded that Africa maintain 90% of our forests they had developed by destroying nature. Now they prevented us from developing by demanding we preserve nature. I studied the economic cost of these environmental restrictions. Forest preservation requirements prevented us from using approximately 43 million hectares of land for agriculture and development. This land could have generated approximately $12 billion yearly in agricultural production and resource extraction. Over 30 years, we sacrificed $360 billion in potential development to preserve forests for Western environmental concerns. But the environmental agreements delivered minimal benefits to Africa. Western countries promised to provide climate financing to help us adapt and develop cleanly. But the financing was tiny compared to the costs they imposed. They promised $100 billion yearly globally. Africa received approximately $12 billion yearly. This was 3% of what we sacrificed through development restrictions. The eighth category of harmful agreements was debt relief programs that claimed to help poor countries but actually maintained control. These programs were presented as generous assistance from wealthy nations, but I discovered they were designed to preserve debt obligations while appearing to provide relief. I examined the heavily indebted poor countries initiative carefully. This program supposedly canceled debt for countries that couldn't repay. But the cancellation came with conditions requiring economic reforms that served Western interests. Countries had to privatize public services, open markets to foreign competition, and maintain business-friendly policies. The debt relief preserved policy control while appearing to provide financial assistance. I calculated that debt relief programs actually cost more than they saved. Burkina Faso received approximately $800 million in debt cancellation under HIPC. But the required policy reforms cost us approximately $4 billion in destroyed industries and lost development over 15 years. We paid 5 times more in policy costs than we received in debt relief. The program was a trap disguised as assistance. After completing this comprehensive audit, I understood that African nations needed to rethink all international agreements fundamentally. Nearly every treaty we had signed was designed to maintain Western control and extract African wealth. The agreements used legal language and technical complexity to hide exploitation. They presented extraction as cooperation and control as partnership. I calculated the total cost of all these agreements over 30 years. Investment treaties cost us $1.3 billion through lawsuits and deterred policies. Trade agreements cost us $21 billion through destroyed industries. Resource contracts cost us $96 billion through undervalued extraction. Loan agreements cost us $12 billion through harmful conditions. Defense treaties cost us $10.2 billion through military dependence. Intellectual property agreements cost us $1.74 billion through excessive prices. Environmental treaties cost us $360 billion through development restrictions. Debt relief programs cost us $4 billion through policy conditions. Total cost, $506.240 billion over 30 years. This was more than 20 times our current annual GDP stolen or prevented through international agreements. The legal framework of international relations was designed to rob us systematically. But I also understood that simply rejecting these agreements wasn't sufficient. We needed to renegotiate or replace them with agreements that actually served our interests. We needed to build alternative legal frameworks that protected African sovereignty and promoted African development. We needed to create new rules for international relations based on fairness rather than exploitation. I started by declaring that Burkina Faso would review all international agreements and renegotiate or terminate any that didn't serve our interests. I announced that we would no longer honor contracts signed by previous governments if those contracts were unfair or harmful. I stated that we would reject any agreement that limited our sovereignty or prevented our development. Western governments and corporations reacted with outrage. They claimed we were violating international law and breaking our commitments. They insisted that agreements were binding regardless of whether they were fair. They threatened legal action and economic retaliation. They demanded we honor contracts that were robbing us. I rejected their demands completely. I explained that agreements signed under duress or through corruption were not legitimate. I argued that contracts that were fundamentally unfair could be voided. I stated that sovereignty meant having the right to reject arrangements that harmed our people. I declared that we would prioritize our national interests over foreign claims. The legal argument was sound. International law recognized that treaties obtained through coercion were void. Agreements that violated fundamental rights could be rejected. Contracts that were unconscionable could be terminated. We had legal grounds to reject agreements that were clearly exploitative. But I also understood that legal arguments alone wouldn't protect us from retaliation. Western powers would use economic and political weapons to punish us for rejecting their agreements. We needed to build power that would allow us to withstand their pressure. I organized a coalition of African countries to renegotiate international agreements collectively. I explained that Western powers could punish one country that rejected unfair treaties. They couldn't punish 30 countries simultaneously. I argued that collective action would protect us while giving us leverage to demand fair terms. I proposed that we coordinate our renegotiation efforts to maximize our bargaining power. The response was cautious initially. Many African leaders feared Western retaliation. They worried about losing aid and investment. They believed that honoring agreements was necessary for maintaining international credibility. They had been taught to accept unfair arrangements rather than challenge them. I addressed their fears directly. I showed them the calculations, proving that agreements were costing us far more than we gained. I explained that Western aid and investment came with conditions that prevented development. I demonstrated that other countries had successfully renegotiated agreements without catastrophic consequences. I proved that collective action would protect us from retaliation. Listen carefully, trade negotiators and corporate lawyers. Remember when you believed your treaties were permanent? Remember when you assumed we'd honor unfair terms forever? Remember when you thought legal language protected your extraction? I changed every assumption. I audited every agreement. I calculated every cost. I organized collective renegotiation. Your treaties ended. Your legal protection failed. Your extraction system is collapsing. Within 6 months, 19 African countries had joined the coalition to renegotiate international agreements. Within 1 year, 32 countries participated. Within 18 months, 41 countries were coordinating their renegotiation efforts. The collective action was building momentum and power. We established common negotiating positions on each type of agreement to prevent Western powers from dividing us through offering marginally different terms to individual nations. For investment treaties, we demanded elimination of investor-state dispute settlement clauses. We insisted on maintaining full sovereignty over economic policy. We required that foreign investors follow the same laws as domestic investors without special protections. We rejected any provisions that gave corporations rights to sue governments. The investment treaty positions were based on documented abuse of ISDS mechanisms by corporations seeking to overturn democratic decisions. Philip Morris sued Uruguay and Australia for implementing cigarette packaging regulations designed to protect public health. Occidental Petroleum sued Ecuador for $1.77 billion after government terminated contract for environmental violations. Vattenfall sued Germany for $4.7 billion after government decided to phase out nuclear power following Fukushima disaster. These cases demonstrated that ISDS gave corporations power to challenge any government policy affecting their profits, regardless of public interest justification. I calculated total ISDS awards against African nations between 2000 and 2024. $12.4 billion paid to corporations for government actions ranging from environmental protection to minimum wage increases to resource nationalization. These payments transferred wealth from African treasuries to foreign corporations for exercising sovereignty over our own territories. The system was designed to make governments afraid to regulate corporations because any regulation could trigger multi-billion-dollar lawsuit. Our position demanded complete elimination of ISDS rather than reform because any arbitration system giving corporations special rights to challenge government policy was fundamentally unjust. Domestic investors had to challenge government actions through national courts applying national law. Foreign investors demanded special international tribunals applying vague investment treaty standards interpreted by corporate lawyers serving as arbitrators. This two-tier system privileged foreign capital over domestic interests and sovereignty. We insisted on maintaining full sovereignty over economic policy without investment treaty restrictions. Existing treaties prohibited indirect expropriation, defined so broadly that virtually any regulation reducing corporate profits could qualify. Environmental regulations, labor standards, health protections, and industrial policies all faced potential ISDS challenges. Our position stated clearly that we retained complete authority to regulate economy for public interest without corporate veto through arbitration threats. We required that foreign investors follow same laws as domestic investors without special protections or privileges. If domestic company violated environmental law, it faced penalties under national legal system. If foreign company violated same law, it should face same penalties through same system, not special treatment through investment treaty protections. Equal treatment meant equal obligations and equal legal accountability. For trade agreements, we demanded reciprocity that was real rather than fake formalism, treating unequal economies as equal. We insisted on maintaining the right to protect infant industries. We required that agricultural subsidies be eliminated on both sides rather than just on ours. We rejected any provisions that prevented us from prioritizing regional trade and industrialization. The trade agreement positions addressed fundamental unfairness in existing arrangements. WTO rules prohibited developing countries from protecting infant industries while allowing developed countries to maintain subsidies protecting their established industries. American and European agricultural subsidies totaled $47 billion annually, making their agricultural products artificially cheap and destroying African farmers' ability to compete. But WTO rules prevented us from protecting our agriculture through tariffs or subsidies. I documented specific impact of this asymmetric trade regime. Senegalese tomato farmers couldn't compete with subsidized European tomato paste. Ghanaian poultry farmers couldn't compete with subsidized American chicken. Kenyan dairy farmers couldn't compete with subsidized European milk powder. Each case represented destroyed livelihoods and prevented industrialization because we couldn't develop processing industries when subsidized imports undercut domestic production. Our position demanded real reciprocity. If Western countries maintained agricultural subsidies, we could protect our agriculture through tariffs. If they eliminated subsidies completely, we would open our markets correspondingly, but we rejected fake reciprocity where we eliminated all protection while they maintained subsidies disguised as domestic support programs. Real reciprocity meant equal treatment in substance, not just formal legal equality between fundamentally unequal economies. We insisted on maintaining right to protect infant industries because all currently developed countries industrialized through protection. Britain protected textile industry in 18th century. United States protected manufacturing in 19th century. Japan protected industry in 20th century. South Korea protected technology industries in late 20th century. Every successful industrialization involved temporary protection, allowing domestic industries to develop before facing international competition. Trade rules preventing us from using same strategy that every developed country used were designed to prevent our industrialization. For resource extraction contracts, we demanded renegotiation of royalty rates to fair market levels. We insisted on requirements that corporations process resources locally rather than exporting them raw. We required environmental protections and community benefit provisions. We rejected automatic renewal clauses and demanded regular renegotiation based on current conditions. The resource contract positions addressed systematic undervaluation of African resources through contracts negotiated when governments were desperate for revenue and lacked bargaining power. I documented examples across continent. Zambian copper contracts paid 0.6% royalties when market rate was 5 to 8%. Democratic Republic of Congo cobalt contracts paid 2% royalties when market rate was 8–12%. Guinea bauxite contracts paid 0.5% royalties when market rate was 4 to 7%. These below-market royalties transferred billions from African nations to mining corporations. I calculated total revenue loss from below-market royalties between 2000 and 2024, $89 billion that should have gone to African treasuries but went to corporate profits instead. This wasn't theft through illegal means, but through legal contracts negotiated under duress when governments needed immediate revenue and corporations exploited weak bargaining positions. The contracts were legal but fundamentally unjust. Our position demanded renegotiating all resource contracts to market rate royalties. We provided detailed market analysis showing appropriate royalty rates for each mineral. We explained that corporations could afford market rates and still profit substantially. We stated clearly that we would terminate contracts if corporations refused renegotiation, forcing them to choose between fair terms and losing access to resources entirely. We insisted on local processing requirements because exporting raw materials prevented industrialization and job creation. Mining company extracting copper ore employed 2,000 workers. Same company processing copper into wire and cable employed 8,000 workers. Exporting raw ore created 2,000 jobs. Processing locally created 8,000 jobs plus additional jobs in supporting industries. Local processing multiplied employment and economic value while building industrial capacity. For loan agreements, we demanded cancellation of odious debt and restructuring of legitimate debt at fair interest rates. We insisted on elimination of policy conditions that prevented development. We required that future loans come without structural adjustment requirements. We rejected any provisions that gave lenders control over our economic policies. The loan agreement positions addressed debt trap created by high interest rates, unfair conditions, and odious debt contracted by dictators serving foreign interests. I documented debt dynamics showing how African nations borrowed $540 billion between 1980 and 2024 and repaid $780 billion in principal and interest, yet still owed $420 billion. We repaid 144% of borrowed amounts but remained indebted due to compound interest and refinancing traps. I identified $127 billion in odious debt contracted by dictators like Mobutu in Congo, Abacha in Nigeria, and Bongo in Gabon. These rulers borrowed billions that went to personal accounts or projects serving foreign interests rather than national development. When dictators were overthrown, their countries remained responsible for debts that never benefited citizens. This violated basic legal principle that debts contracted without authorization and not benefiting the people are not legitimate obligations. Our position demanded complete cancellation of odious debt identified through transparent audit process. We provided documentation showing which loans went to dictators' personal accounts, which funded projects serving foreign companies, and which were used to suppress democratic movements. We argued that lenders who provided funds to known dictators bore responsibility for enabling theft and shouldn't be repaid from treasuries of democratic governments. For legitimate debt, we demanded restructuring at fair interest rates reflecting actual risk. IMF and World Bank charged African nations 4.8% average interest, while their own borrowing costs were 1.2%. This 3.6 percentage point spread was excessive, given that loans were secured by our resources and backed by international institutions' enforcement power. We demanded that interest rates be reduced to 2.4%, splitting difference between our current rates and lenders' borrowing costs. For defense treaties, we demanded removal of foreign military bases from African territory. We insisted on ending requirements to purchase weapons from specific countries. We required full sovereignty over our security decisions. We rejected any provisions that gave foreign militaries special access or privileges in our countries. The defense treaty positions addressed military arrangements that compromised sovereignty while providing minimal security benefits. France maintained military bases in Djibouti, Chad, Ivory Coast, Gabon, and Senegal under agreements signed by post-colonial governments. These bases gave France military presence, enabling intervention in African affairs while providing little benefit to host nations. United States operated drone bases in Niger and Somalia under agreements that gave American military extensive privileges. I documented that foreign military bases served external interests rather than host nation security. French bases in Chad and Central African Republic enabled interventions, maintaining governments serving French interests. American bases in Niger and Somalia conducted operations that host governments often didn't control or approve. Foreign military presence compromised sovereignty by giving external powers ability to project force from our territory regardless of our interests. Our position demanded closure of all foreign military bases on African territory. We explained that genuine security partnerships didn't require permanent foreign bases but could operate through cooperation between sovereign nations. We stated that we would terminate base agreements if countries refused closure, forcing them to choose between voluntary departure and expulsion. We insisted on ending tied military aid, requiring purchase of weapons from specific countries. American military assistance required purchasing American weapons at prices 40% higher than comparable Russian or Chinese alternatives. French military cooperation required purchasing French weapons at similarly inflated prices. Tide aid served weapons manufacturers more than African security by forcing us to buy expensive equipment when cheaper alternatives existed. For intellectual property agreements, we demanded exceptions allowing production of generic medicines for public health. We insisted on protection of traditional knowledge from biopiracy. We required that patents not prevent access to essential technologies. We rejected any provisions that prioritized corporate profits over human needs. The intellectual property positions addressed how patent rules prevented access to essential medicines and technologies while enabling biopiracy of African traditional knowledge. I documented specific cases. Pharmaceutical companies charged $12,000 annually for HIV antiretroviral drugs that generic manufacturers could produce for $340. Patent protections prevented African countries from producing or importing generics, forcing millions to die from treatable disease because they couldn't afford patented drugs. I calculated that strict patent enforcement cost African lives measurably. In 2001, before generic competition, 200,000 Africans received HIV treatment at $12,000 per person annually. In 2024, after generic competition was permitted, 12 million Africans received treatment at $340 per person annually. Patent enforcement during 2001 to 2024 prevented 8 million people from receiving treatment, resulting in approximately 2.4 million preventable deaths. Patent rules killed millions to protect pharmaceutical profits. Our position demanded automatic exceptions allowing production and importation of generic medicines for public health emergencies. We defined public health emergency broadly to include any situation where patents prevented access to essential medicines. We stated that saving lives took absolute priority over protecting pharmaceutical profits, and any agreement prioritizing profits over lives was morally unacceptable and would be terminated. We insisted on protecting traditional knowledge from biopiracy, where corporations patented African plants, medicines, and agricultural varieties that communities had developed over generations. Western companies had patented Hoodia appetite suppressant from southern African San people, rooibos tea from South African communities, and teff grain from Ethiopian farmers. These patents gave corporations monopoly rights over knowledge that African communities had created and shared freely. For environmental agreements, we demanded that emission limits be based on historical responsibility and per capita fairness. We insisted on substantial climate financing that actually compensated for development restrictions. We required that forest preservation be voluntary and compensated fairly. We rejected any provisions that prevented our development while allowing Western countries to continue polluting. The environmental agreement positions addressed fundamental unfairness in climate negotiations, where countries that caused problem demanded that poor countries bear costs of solving it. I documented that Western countries had emitted 79% of cumulative CO2 emissions since industrialization, while Africa emitted 3%. Western per capita emissions averaged 12.4 tons annually, while African per capita emissions averaged 1.1 tons. Yet, climate agreements demanded that we restrict development to meet emission limits while Western countries continued high emissions. I calculated that meeting proposed emission limits would cost Africa $340 billion in foregone development between 2025 and 2040. We would have to forego coal power plants, limit industrial expansion, and restrict agricultural development to stay within emission budgets. Meanwhile, Western countries that had already industrialized through unlimited emissions demanded we stay poor to solve climate problem they created. Our position demanded that emission limits reflect historical responsibility and per capita fairness. Countries that emitted more historically should reduce more. Countries with high per capita emissions should cut more than countries with low emissions. Africa, with 3% of historical emissions and 1.1 tons per capita, should be allowed to increase emissions for development, while Western countries with 79% of historical emissions and 12.4 tons per capita should make deep cuts. We insisted on climate financing of $200 billion annually to compensate for development restrictions. This amount reflected actual costs of meeting emission limits through expensive renewable energy instead of cheap fossil fuels. We explained that we would not sacrifice development for climate goals without compensation enabling us to develop cleanly. Western countries that caused climate change through unlimited emissions should pay for clean development pathways they demanded we follow. The common positions gave us enormous negotiating leverage that individual countries lacked. Western countries and corporations couldn't play us against each other by offering slightly better terms to individual countries. They had to negotiate with our coalition collectively. They faced unified demands that they couldn't divide and conquer around. The solidarity transformed the power dynamics completely. I documented how divide and conquer tactics had prevented previous reform attempts. In 2015, several African countries sought to renegotiate mining contracts. Companies offered marginally better terms to individual countries on condition they negotiate separately and not coordinate with neighbors. Countries that accepted separate negotiations got 1 to 2 percentage point royalty increases. Countries that held out for collective negotiation faced investment withdrawal threats. Divide and conquer prevented substantial reforms because countries feared being singled out for economic punishment. Our coalition eliminated this vulnerability by making negotiations collective and coordination binding. All 41 member countries committed to not negotiating separately. Any country approached with separate deal would report it to coalition and reject it. We would only accept agreements negotiated with coalition collectively or applied uniformly to all members. This unity eliminated companies' ability to pick off individual countries. The leverage was substantial because collectively we controlled resources that Western economies needed. 41 African countries represented 87% of global cobalt supply, 67% of platinum, 54% of diamonds, 47% of gold, and 39% of chromium. Companies couldn't simply shift to alternative suppliers because we controlled majority of global production. They had to negotiate with us on our terms or lose access to essential resources. We also represented markets that Western companies wanted to access. 41 countries with combined population of 980 million and GDP of $2.1 trillion were valuable market for consumer goods, technology, and services. Companies that refused fair resource contract terms could be excluded from market access. The combination of resource control and market access gave us leverage that individual countries couldn't achieve. Western negotiators initially refused to engage with our demands seriously. They claimed our positions were unreasonable and unrealistic. They insisted we had to honor existing agreements regardless of fairness. They threatened economic consequences if we didn't moderate our demands. They tried to intimidate us into accepting continued exploitation. I documented their specific responses to show how they attempted to preserve exploitative arrangements. To our demand for eliminating ISDS, they claimed investors needed protection from arbitrary government actions. To our insistence on protecting infant industries, they argued free trade benefited everyone. To our demand for market rate royalties, they claimed existing contracts were legally binding. To our call for debt cancellation, they insisted all debts must be repaid. Each response defended existing exploitation while ignoring fundamental unfairness. To our call for debt cancellation, they insisted all debts must be repaid. Each response defended existing exploitation while ignoring fundamental unfairness. But we maintained our positions firmly without compromising on core principles. We explained that we would terminate agreements if they weren't renegotiated fairly. We demonstrated that we had alternatives through BRICS partnerships providing financing, trade, and investment without exploitative terms. We showed that we could withstand economic pressure through collective support, where countries facing sanctions would receive assistance from coalition partners. We proved we were serious about ending exploitative arrangements through beginning termination procedures on 12 agreements as demonstration of resolve. The negotiations lasted 18 months and were difficult and contentious at every stage. Western negotiators fought to preserve every advantage in existing agreements. They offered minimal concessions while demanding we maintain most obligations. They used every tactic to avoid fundamental changes to agreements that served their interests. I participated in key negotiation sessions and observed their strategies firsthand. They would concede on minor issues to create appearance of compromise while refusing changes to fundamental exploitation mechanisms. They offered 1% royalty increases while defending ISDS provisions, enabling them to sue if we raised royalties further. They accepted environmental protection language while ensuring it had no enforcement mechanisms. They agreed to review clauses while maintaining automatic renewal provisions, ensuring agreements continued indefinitely. They used complexity to obscure continued exploitation. Investment treaty negotiations involved 400-page documents with technical legal language designed to confuse rather than clarify. They would concede on visible provisions in main text while inserting loopholes in annexes and side letters. They relied on our limited legal capacity to miss provisions that undermined apparent concessions. We countered by hiring experienced international lawyers and refusing to sign anything until our legal team verified that all provisions matched agreed principles. They employed delay tactics, hoping we would lose patience or unity. They scheduled negotiations during planting seasons when agriculture ministers couldn't attend. They requested additional studies and impact assessments that took months to complete. They raised new technical objections to provisions we thought were settled. They hoped that extended negotiations would fracture our coalition as countries faced domestic pressure to conclude agreements and gain economic benefits. But we had leverage they couldn't overcome through delay or complexity. We controlled resources they needed for industries that couldn't wait years for new suppliers. We represented markets they wanted to access for products facing competition from Chinese alternatives. We could shift to alternative partners if they didn't negotiate fairly, as several countries demonstrated by signing BRICS agreements while Western negotiations stalled. The leverage forced them to make real concessions rather than cosmetic changes. On investment treaties, we achieved elimination of ISDS in 67% of renegotiated agreements and substantial restrictions in remaining 33%. On trade agreements, we secured right to protect infant industries for 15 years in 73% of agreements. On resource contracts, we obtained royalty increases averaging 4.2 percentage points across 89 renegotiated agreements. On loan agreements, we achieved cancellation of $38 billion in odious debt and restructuring of $167 billion at reduced interest rates. I calculated total financial impact of renegotiated agreements. Investment treaty changes saved estimated $890 million annually in avoided ISDS awards. Trade agreement changes enabled industrial development worth estimated $12.4 billion annually. Resource contract renegotiations increased government revenues by $7.8 billion annually. Loan restructuring saved $4.2 billion annually in reduced interest payments and eliminated $38 billion in odious debt obligations. Total annual benefit, $25.3 billion, representing 1.2% of collective GDP and 8.7% of government revenues. Over 20 years, renegotiated agreements would generate $506 billion in additional revenue and savings for African governments. This amount exceeded total Western aid to Africa over same period, proving that ending exploitation through fair agreements delivered more resources than accepting exploitation while receiving aid designed to make exploitation politically acceptable. I am the architect of Africa's comprehensive renegotiation of international agreements. I audited 147 agreements across 6 categories. I calculated $506 billion in costs from exploitative provisions. I identified exploitation mechanisms in every category from investment to environment. I organized 41 countries into negotiating coalition with binding coordination. I established common positions demanding fairness across all agreement types. I maintained firm stance through 18 months of difficult negotiations. I achieved renegotiation of 83% of harmful agreements with substantial improvements in fairness. The comprehensiveness was essential because exploitation operated across all agreement types simultaneously. Fixing investment treaties while maintaining exploitative trade agreements would simply shift extraction from one mechanism to another. Renegotiating resource contracts while maintaining odious debt would transfer gained revenue to debt service. Addressing each exploitation mechanism required comprehensive approach targeting all simultaneously. I documented that comprehensive renegotiation delivered superior results to piecemeal reforms. Countries that renegotiated only resource contracts saw revenues increase but faced ISDS suits when they tried to regulate mining companies. Countries that restructured debt without addressing trade agreements saved on interest but lost revenue to subsidized imports, destroying domestic industries. Countries that reformed investment treaties while maintaining military bases found that foreign military presence enabled coups when governments challenged other exploitative arrangements. Only comprehensive reform addressing all exploitation mechanisms simultaneously achieved lasting sovereignty. Your legacy is 60 years of exploitative treaties that extracted $506 billion from Africa through below-market royalties, prevented industrialization through trade rules, compromised sovereignty through ISDS provisions, and maintained control through military bases, Western treaty makers. My legacy is renegotiating agreements to serve African interests instead of Western extraction, achieving $25 billion in annual benefits and $506 billion over 20 years. History will remember which approach served Africa better. The answer is written in the $96 billion extracted through below-market resource contracts, the $21 billion lost through asymmetric trade agreements, the $12 billion paid in ISDS awards, the $38 billion in odious debt, and the comprehensive renegotiation achieving fairness across all categories. You designed treaties to rob us legally through provisions that appeared fair but systematically favored your interests. We renegotiated to end the theft through collective action and firm demands. The lesson is eternal because exploitation through legal mechanisms is still exploitation requiring resistance. The proof is mathematical because documented costs and achieved savings demonstrate exploitation's scale and renegotiation's benefits. The outcome is permanent because renegotiated agreements establish new baseline that future negotiations will build on rather than retreat from. African nations should rethink international agreements because nearly all were designed to maintain Western control and extract our wealth rather than promote mutual benefit. We proved this through comprehensive audits, showing massive costs across agreement categories. We organized collective action to renegotiate unfair terms through coalition building and common positions. We achieved agreements that serve our development instead of preventing it through persistent negotiation backed by real leverage. The transformation is spreading as more countries recognize they can challenge exploitative arrangements successfully. I documented specific examples of other regions following African precedent. Latin American countries formed coalition in 2024, renegotiating investment treaties with United States and Europe. 12 countries demanded elimination of ISDS and achieved restrictions in 78% of agreements. Southeast Asian nations coordinated positions on trade agreements in 2025, insisting on right to protect strategic industries. 8 countries achieved special safeguard provisions allowing temporary protection during industrialization. Middle Eastern countries collectively renegotiated resource contracts in 2025, increasing royalties by average 3.8 percentage points across 67 agreements. Each regional effort validated our approach and demonstrated its replicability. Latin America's investment treaty renegotiation showed that ISDS elimination was achievable despite corporate opposition. Southeast Asia's trade coordination proved that even countries deeply integrated in global supply chains could demand policy space for development. Middle East's resource contract reforms demonstrated that even oil-rich countries with strong bargaining positions benefited from collective action, amplifying individual leverage. The spreading transformation reflected growing recognition that international agreements had been designed to maintain power imbalances rather than promote genuine cooperation. Developing countries across all regions realized they had accepted unfair terms because they negotiated individually from weak positions. Collective action transformed negotiations from weak supplicants requesting favors to strong coalitions demanding fairness as equals. I documented how this recognition spread through specific mechanisms connecting African experience to other regions. Regional organizations hosted conferences where African negotiators shared lessons learned from collective renegotiation. South American ministers attended African Union summits, observing how coalition coordination worked in practice. Southeast Asian trade officials studied our common position documents, adapting them for their contexts. Middle Eastern resource ministers analyzed our royalty renegotiation strategies, applying similar approaches to oil contracts. Knowledge transfer was deliberate and systematic rather than accidental. The recognition that agreements were designed to maintain imbalances rather than promote cooperation came from comparing formal equality with substantive inequality in treaty provisions. Investment treaties formally treated all investors equally but substantively privileged foreign investors through ISDS access that domestic investors lacked. Trade agreements formally applied same rules to all countries, but substantively harmed developing countries by prohibiting industrial protection that developed countries had used during their own industrialization. Loan agreements formally offered assistance but substantively created debt traps through high interest and restrictive conditions. I analyzed specific examples demonstrating designed imbalance. Energy Charter Treaty covering energy investments in 53 countries gave foreign energy companies right to sue governments through ISDS, but gave governments no corresponding right to sue companies for environmental damage or contract violations. Asymmetry was a deliberate design feature protecting investor interests while exposing government policy to corporate veto. Treaty appeared neutral but functioned to privilege capital over sovereignty. WTO agreement on agriculture required developing countries to eliminate agricultural subsidies while allowing developed countries to maintain domestic support programs that functioned identically to prohibited subsidies but were classified differently in agreement text. United States and European Union maintained $47 billion in annual agricultural subsidies through loopholes, while developing countries were prohibited from protecting farmers. Asymmetry was designed into classification system that appeared neutral but functionally privileged developed country agriculture. Paris Agreement on climate change required all countries to submit emission reduction pledges, but didn't require developed countries to provide promised climate financing, enabling developing countries to reduce emissions without sacrificing development. Developed countries pledged $100 billion annually, but delivered only $83 billion, with most provided as loans rather than grants. Agreement imposed emission obligations without corresponding financing obligations, privileging developed countries that had already industrialized through unlimited emissions. Developing countries realized they had accepted these unfair terms because they negotiated individually from weak positions where refusing agreement meant isolation and economic punishment. Individual country refusing to sign investment treaty with ISDS faced capital flight to countries that accepted such terms. Individual country protecting infant industries faced WTO dispute settlement and authorized trade sanctions. Individual country refusing Paris Agreement pledges faced international condemnation and exclusion from climate financing. Isolation was economically and politically costly, forcing acceptance of unfair terms. Collective action transformed this dynamic completely by making isolation impossible when dozens of countries coordinated positions. Western powers couldn't isolate 41 African countries simultaneously without devastating their own access to resources and markets. They couldn't sanction entire regions without triggering economic crisis, affecting their own economies. They couldn't exclude coalitions from agreements because agreements needed broad participation to function effectively. Collective action turned weakness into strength by making punishment of coordination prohibitively expensive for those attempting it. The transformation from supplicants to equals was visible in negotiation dynamics and outcomes. Before collective action, developing country negotiators entered discussions hoping to minimize exploitation rather than demanding fairness. They accepted that investment treaties would include ISDS and negotiated only over procedural details. They acknowledged that trade agreements would restrict industrial policy and sought only narrow exceptions. They understood that loan agreements would include conditions and bargained only over specific requirements. The negotiating posture was defensive, accepting exploitation as inevitable and seeking only to limit damage. After collective action, developing country negotiators demanded fundamental fairness rather than marginal improvements. They insisted on eliminating ISDS entirely rather than accepting it with procedural reforms. They required maintaining full industrial policy space rather than accepting restrictions with narrow exceptions. They demanded loans without conditions rather than negotiating over which conditions were acceptable. The negotiating posture was offensive, rejecting exploitation as unacceptable and demanding relationships between equals. I observed this transformation personally in negotiation sessions. In 2021, investment treaty negotiations before collective action, African negotiators proposed modest ISDS reforms, like requiring exhaustion of local remedies before arbitration. Western negotiators rejected even these minimal changes, and African negotiators accepted rejection because individual countries lacked leverage to insist. In 2024 negotiations with collective action, African negotiators demanded complete ISDS elimination. Western negotiators initially refused, but African coalition maintained position, and Western negotiators eventually accepted elimination in 67% of treaties and substantial restrictions in remaining 33%. Collective leverage transformed what was achievable. Your legal colonialism is ending as countries recognize that agreements designed to maintain exploitation can be challenged and renegotiated. Your divide and conquer tactics are failing as collective action prevents picking off individual countries. Your threats of economic consequences are losing power as alternatives through BRICS and South-South cooperation reduce dependence on Western markets and financing. Your era of dictating terms is finished as our unity creates leverage, forcing genuine negotiation. The end of legal colonialism represented fundamental shift in international order where law had functioned to legitimize exploitation rather than prevent it. Colonial era used military force to extract resources and control territories. Post-colonial era replaced military occupation with legal agreements achieving similar extraction and control through ostensibly voluntary treaties. Investment treaties gave corporations rights to challenge government policy. Trade agreements prevented industrial development. Loan agreements imposed policy conditions. Defense treaties maintained military presence. Each agreement type functioned to maintain control while appearing consensual. I documented that legal colonialism was more effective than military colonialism for maintaining exploitation because it created appearance of consent and equality. Military occupation was obviously coercive and generated resistance. Legal agreements appeared voluntary and equal, making resistance seem illegitimate. Country challenging investment treaty appeared to be violating rule of law rather than resisting exploitation. Country protecting industries appeared to be violating trade commitments rather than pursuing development. Legal form obscured exploitative substance, making resistance more difficult than under obvious military occupation. Recognition that legal form concealed exploitative substance enabled challenging agreements as illegitimate despite their legal validity. We argued that agreements negotiated under economic duress, when countries desperately needed revenue or financing, were not genuinely voluntary. We demonstrated that formal equality in treaty text masked substantive inequality in provisions' actual effects. We proved that agreements serving only one party's interests while harming the other violated basic principles of contract fairness. Legal validity didn't equal moral legitimacy, and illegitimate agreements should be renegotiated regardless of legal enforceability. Divide and conquer tactics had been essential for maintaining legal colonialism because they prevented collective resistance that could challenge systemic exploitation. Western powers would offer marginally better terms to individual countries on condition they negotiate separately and not coordinate with neighbors. Country accepting separate deal got 1 to 2% better terms than standard agreement but undermined collective bargaining that could achieve 10-15% improvements. Divide and conquer prevented transformative change by offering individual countries minor improvements, preventing them from joining collective action, achieving major reforms. I analyzed specific examples showing how divide and conquer maintained exploitation. In 2018, several African countries sought to renegotiate mining contracts collectively. Mining companies offered individual countries royalty increases from 2% to 3.5% on condition they negotiate separately. 3 countries accepted, getting 1.5 percentage point increases. Remaining countries maintained collective position and eventually achieved 4.2 percentage point increases to 6.2%. Countries that accepted separate deals got 75% increases, while countries maintaining unity got 210% increases. Divide and conquer prevented optimal outcomes by offering suboptimal individual deals. Our collective action failed, divide and conquer, by making coordination binding and transparent. All coalition members committed publicly to not negotiating separately. Any member approached with separate offer would report it to coalition and reject it regardless of terms. We shared all communications with potential negotiating partners, ensuring transparency. We established that accepting separate deal would result in exclusion from coalition and loss of collective support. These commitments made divide and conquer impossible because individual countries couldn't be picked off without losing more through exclusion than gaining through separate terms. Threats of economic consequences had been primary enforcement mechanism for legal colonialism. Country challenging investment treaty faced capital flight and investment withdrawal. Country protecting industries faced WTO-authorized trade sanctions. Country refusing loan conditions faced aid cutoffs and credit rating downgrades. Threats made resistance costly, forcing compliance despite agreements' unfairness. Economic punishment for resistance maintained system even when countries recognized exploitation. But threats were losing power as alternatives through BRICS and South-South cooperation reduced dependence on Western markets and financing. Country-facing investment withdrawal could attract BRICS financing at better terms without ISDS requirements. Country-facing trade sanctions could redirect exports to Chinese and Indian markets. Country refusing IMF conditions could borrow from BRICS' new development bank without policy requirements. Alternatives eliminated threats' coercive power by providing options when Western powers attempted punishment. I calculated that BRICS alternatives had reduced Western economic leverage by approximately 60% between 2020 and 2025. African exports to BRICS countries increased from $87 billion to $234 billion, reducing dependence on Western markets. BRICS financing to Africa grew from $23 billion to $89 billion annually, reducing dependence on IMF and World Bank. BRICS foreign direct investment in Africa expanded from $12 billion to $47 billion yearly, reducing dependence on Western capital. Each alternative reduced Western leverage proportionally, making threats of economic consequences less credible and less effective. South-South cooperation amplified alternatives' impact by creating multiple options beyond BRICS. African countries increased trade with each other from $89 billion to $131 billion through gold-backed currency coordination. Latin American countries expanded financing cooperation through regional development banks. Southeast Asian nations deepened investment relationships through ASEAN frameworks. Each South-South relationship reduced dependence on Western markets, financing, and investment, further eroding Western leverage. Your era of dictating terms is finished as our unity creates leverage, forcing genuine negotiation between equals rather than imposition by dominant party. Dictating terms had been possible when developing countries negotiated individually from weak positions, where refusing Western terms meant isolation and economic crisis. Unity transformed weak individual positions into strong collective position, where refusing our terms meant Western powers losing access to resources and markets worth trillions. The leverage reversal forced genuine negotiation, where both parties had to accommodate the other's interests rather than one party imposing terms on the other. I documented specific negotiations showing this transformation. In 2019 investment treaty negotiations before collective action, Western countries presented draft treaty with ISDS and informed individual African countries they could accept it or have no treaty. African countries accepted because refusing meant capital flight. In 2024 negotiations with collective action, African coalition presented demands for ISDS elimination and informed Western countries they could accept it or lose investment access to 41 countries. Western countries negotiated because refusing meant losing access to resources and markets. Power dynamics had completely reversed. Our sovereignty is real rather than nominal because we control our resources, protect our industries, and govern our economies according to our interests instead of your demands. Real sovereignty means having alternatives when you threaten sanctions, having resources you need when you demand concessions, having unity when you try division, and having persistence when you hope will surrender. Real sovereignty is demonstrated through renegotiated agreements serving our development instead of your extraction. The distinction between nominal and real sovereignty was crucial for understanding transformation we achieved. Nominal sovereignty meant having flag, anthem, UN seat, and formal legal independence, while remaining economically controlled through agreements, debt, and dependency. Real sovereignty meant having actual control over resources, policy, and development trajectory regardless of foreign pressure. Most post-colonial African states had nominal sovereignty without real sovereignty, making independence largely symbolic rather than substantive. I analyzed components of real sovereignty showing how each required specific capabilities and conditions. Resource control required physical infrastructure, enabling us to extract, process, and export resources without depending on foreign-controlled routes or facilities. We achieved this through Chinese-built railways, our own processing plants, and BRICS payment systems settling transactions without Western financial intermediaries. Resource control was real when we could export regardless of Western approval or cooperation. Industrial protection required policy space to implement tariffs, subsidies, and regulations supporting domestic industries despite trade agreement restrictions. We achieved this through renegotiating agreements to maintain industrial policy authority, building industries before signing restrictive agreements, and coordinating with other countries facing similar restrictions. Industrial protection was real when we could implement policies serving our development regardless of WTO complaints or Western pressure. Economic governance required ability to make policy decisions based on our interests rather than foreign conditions attached to financing or market access. We achieved this through BRICS financing without conditions, gold-backed currencies eliminating monetary control, and collective action making isolation impossible. Economic governance was real when we could choose policies serving our citizens regardless of IMF objections or investor threats. Real sovereignty meant having alternatives when threatened with sanctions because alternatives eliminated coercive power of threats. We had alternative export markets in BRICS countries, alternative financing from BRICS banks, alternative currencies through gold backing, and alternative partners through South-South cooperation. When Western powers threatened sanctions, we could redirect trade and financing to alternatives, making threats ineffective. Alternatives transformed sovereignty from nominal to real by eliminating dependence that had made resistance impossible. Real sovereignty meant having resources that Western economies needed, creating mutual dependence rather than one-way dependency. We controlled 87% of global cobalt, 67% of platinum, 54% of diamonds, and 47% of gold. Western industries needed these resources for technology, manufacturing, and jewelry. When Western powers demanded concessions, we could threaten supply restrictions, forcing them to accommodate our interests. Resource control created leverage, making sovereignty real rather than nominal. Real sovereignty meant having unity, preventing divide and conquer tactics that had maintained control through offering individual countries marginally better terms for separate negotiations. Our coalition committed to coordinated positions and transparent communication, making it impossible to pick off individual countries. When Western powers tried division, we maintained unity, forcing them to negotiate with coalition collectively. Unity transformed sovereignty from nominal to real by creating collective leverage that individual countries lacked. Real sovereignty meant having persistence when Western powers hoped we would surrender to pressure and accept exploitative terms. We maintained positions through 18 months of difficult negotiations despite threats, delays, and minimal initial concessions. We demonstrated willingness to terminate agreements if renegotiation failed. We proved we would accept economic costs of resistance rather than submit to continued exploitation. Persistence transformed sovereignty from nominal to real by showing we valued independence more than short-term economic benefits from accepting unfair terms.